The first time I met Pat was in April of 1983 when I came to the Harvard Graduate School of Education for a job interview. Pat was in her second year as dean, and I was simply a lowly job candidate. We met in the dean's office, and the very first thing Pat said to me was, "Do you want this job because you want to be at our School of Education? Or do you want this job because you want to be at Harvard and this is the only job available?" That was the first, but by no means the last time I learned that Pat asked hard questions and that all conversations with her are learning experiences. I've come to learn that Pat not only asks hard questions, but also that she is willing to help others to answer them, and is very skilled in doing so. Countless times over the last 20 years, I've come to ask her for advice, and I've always left her office with sensible guidance, and usually with some very interesting, sometimes extremely juicy personal stories about important people in American education. Pat has provided me and my co-author, Frank Levy, with detailed comments on early drafts of 2 books we wrote about economics, and as a result of her comments, the books ended up a lot better than they otherwise would have been. What path led Pat Graham to her current position as one of the nation's leading historians of American education, and indeed one of the leading figures in American education? An interesting path, to be sure, but not a straight one. Those of you who've read Pat's book that she's going to talk about tonight, Schooling America, know parts of the answer, including some details about her upbringing in the Midwest. Pat's professional career in education began when she accepted a teaching position at Deep Creek High School in Norfolk, Virginia. Over subsequent decades, she taught at the University of Indiana, at Teachers College Columbia, and here at HGSC. Now, so far, this seems like a pretty straight academic path. But there were interruptions in her academic life, some lasting as long as a decade, during which she assumed important leadership roles. These include being director of the Radcliffe Institute in the mid-1970s, being director of the National Institute of Education in the late 1970s, being dean of our School of Education from 1982 to 1991, and being the president of the Spencer Foundation from 1991 to 2000. In all of these positions, Pat displayed a real vision, success in implementing her vision, and a concern for nurturing the people who worked with her. The number of people, and I include myself in this group, whose working careers have been supported by Pat is very large, and I believe that all of us feel blessed by having Pat touch our lives. Over her career, Pat has written about a range of topics. Titles of her published articles include America's Unsystematic Education System, 1974. Historian as Policymaker, 1980. The Cult of True Womanhood, Past and Present, 1983. Schools, Cacophony About Practice, Silence About Purpose, 1984. Battleships and Schools, 1995. Education Reform, Why Now, 2002. Pat's writings are important not only because they address interesting questions, bring a range of data to bear in answering them, and are well written. They're also important because they say things that need to be said, some of which are not said nearly often enough. And I want to conclude my introduction by reading a paragraph from the first page of an article that Pat wrote in 2002. Schools are powerfully influenced by the neighborhoods of which they are a part, and hence in affluent communities, such as Wilmette, Illinois, school administrators and teachers labor diligently to provide an instruction and ambience that the well-educated and wealthy taxpayers of that community seek for their children. Similarly, 25 miles away, In South Chicago, where many children reside in circumstances of poverty, the school staffs include many people who were themselves denied a decent schooling and whose college experience was a mockery of higher education. The present reform movement expects both kinds of schools to assure that their children meet equivalent standards of achievement. Such performances are not likely unless more is done to assist the children of South Chicago than simply to tell their teachers to do better by them. I look forward now to hearing from Pat Albjerg Graham.
Thank you, Dick, very much. You know, Dick is talking about when he came to the ed school. When he came to the ed school, we on the faculty and the administration, the staff of the ed school, were in a very anxious period in our life because we were concerned that we'd be able to reinstitute tenure at the ed school, which had been hung up for about 10 years. We haven't been able to make any tenure appointments. And we thought if we could recruit somebody like Dick Murnane, that would really be the kind of person we wanted to have. We had to impress Derek Bach, the then and yet again president of Harvard. And and Derek Bach thought that this Murnane fellow looked pretty good. And he was actually pleased that we at the ed school had pulled up our socks and were able to recruit somebody like Dick. And so we were very thankful that PR message had gotten across. And so pretty soon Derek Bach came over here to the ed school to give a little lecture in which he was going to teach us about how to understand things. And he gave a very good lecture, very serious, very comprehensive. And it was about 5 o'clock in the evening when he was talking about the same time. And he said, where's Dick Murnane? Everybody was here. Where's Dick Murnane? He said, now Dick Murnane would have something to add on this point. I looked around, I was sitting up here, and I looked around, and I looked everywhere, and there was no Dick Murnane. Dick Murnane was not president when the president came to speak. I thought, yeah. And so Derek then turned to me, and he said, Pat, where's Dick Murnane? Oh, I said, I'm sure he's teaching. What I did not know was that he truly was teaching. But the point was he was at home so that his wife, Mary Jo, a medical researcher, could stay a little later in her lab and he could teach his 2 little boys who were coming home from school. And I've always thought that was the most wonderful answer to the question, even though I didn't know that was the case. But the ed school has been very fortunate to recruit many excellent people, of whom Dick was one of the early ones who came, at least when I was in the recruiting business. I want to say how grateful I am to the ed school for helping me produce this book. I'm first of all extremely grateful to Elizabeth City, who is a doctoral student, who was extremely helpful in doing this in a direct way. But I'm also very appreciative of the ed school in general. This book came out of a course that I had to teach called something, it was a kind of a descendant of a history of education course, and it was called Historical Perspectives on Education, and I knew that would bore people to death. So I tried to gin up something that would be a little more lively. And in conversations with my colleagues at the ed school, and especially that strange band up there on the 4th floor of Gutman, and from the students, I have benefited enormously. So what is this book about? Well, This book is called Schooling America, not the title I chose. I wanted to call it Wanting and Getting, What Americans Have Wanted and What They Have Gotten from Their Schools. People said, oh, terrible idea. I frequently had that response to my ideas on various subjects. Secondly, and Howard Gardner, who has heard this before, he and his wife, Ellen Winter, and my husband and I were having brunch at the Sheridan Commander, and Ellen came up with a wonderful title, Shifting Assignments. I really like that title, because that's really what it's been about, the shifting assignments that the schools in America have received over the last century. Oxford University Press said not possible. They then had the idea I should call it Knowledge and Virtue. And I thought that would really put people to sleep. But in fact, this is a book about knowledge and virtue, or as I would prefer to say, wit and character, and the extent to which we have asked our schools to provide our younger generation with wit and with character, and how the emphasis has changed over time between an emphasis on wit or knowledge or an emphasis on virtue or character. And my argument is going to be that we have been much more interested in instilling character or virtue in our children than we have been in instilling knowledge or wit, although the emphasis has changed over time. This is a book about schooling. It's not a book about education. It's a book about schooling as educational institutions. I think one of the main issues of research of the second half of the 20th century has been how we have seen that there is, in fact, a difference between schooling and between education. Education are all those kinds of activities that people engage in that are not part of schooling. And when children come to school, we assume often that they have similar experiences, when in fact they do not. So, what is this book? This book deals with A's, 4 A's. We're educators, we like A's. We think A's are much better than F's for any one of a variety of reasons. So this is about, chronologically, the period of assimilation, when the principal thing we wanted the schools to do was to assimilate our young people, 1900, 1920. Then the period 1920 to 1954, adjustment. Then the period 1954 to 1983, access. And then the period to the present, 1983 to the present, achievement. And then, because I don't want those of you in higher education to feel left out, the last chapter deals with 2 more A's, in which I tried to talk about the completion of schooling, which now includes college, which it certainly did not in 1900, and the period of autonomy to accountability. Now, it will astonish nearly everybody in this room if I'm able to make the PowerPoint work. Those of you who have known me have known this has not been my long suit. But Bob is here, and that is crucial to my scheme of things. When I was at AERA and I got ready to do this, it wouldn't work. And then I thanked the Almighty because Susan Cardos was sitting on the front row, a graduate of ours, and she came up and she made it work. Ah, perfect. Okay, should I use this one or this one?
I'm supposed to be able to use that one. You can use either one.
Okay. All right, this is the first. If I want to go back, do I hit this one? No, guess not. All right. Isn't he a cute boy? Isn't he absolutely adorable? This little boy exemplifies assimilation. You'll see him again. This little boy figures prominently in this scenario. There he is. This is Danish-speaking Victor.
Just that button there.
This one? All right. Don't leave.
Not the right.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. This little boy began school in 1900. He was the third of 9 children in his family, little Victor. His older brother Mats and his older sister Esther had begun school earlier in this rural community, Otter Tail County, Minnesota. They had not liked school. It had not been a pleasant experience. Little Victor was a little apprehensive because if his big brother and his big sister didn't like school, he was a little apprehensive. And his father, who didn't speak much English, gave him one piece of advice on the day that he was to go to school. He says, when the teacher points at you, you should stand up and say, "My name is Victor Lincoln Albjerg." Then you should sit down. The day dawned. He went to school. Eventually the teacher pointed at him, and he stood up and he said, "My name is Victor Lincoln Albjerg." At which point the children in the class all broke into derisive laughter, and the teacher hit him. Of course, she hadn't asked him what his name was. She'd asked him something else. And what she conceived her task to be was to make these foreign children literate in English. And she thought that any use of the family language would get in the way of what her principal purpose was. Little Victor got over that. Little Victor was my father. Little Victor succeeded in school. Victor is the one in the center, the boy in the center, and you'll see something that took me a very long time to figure out, namely that there have always been more girls completing school in America than there have been boys throughout the 20th century. This was completion. This was school completion in 1908 when you finished the 8th grade. And what did they learn in the 8th grade? Well, what they learned in the 8th grade was some familiarity with English, a little familiarity with numbers, penmanship. Penmanship was more important than writing. Today we say writing, meaning that you're supposed to write something that's interesting. Then they said penmanship, that meant you write a clean hand. And you learned a few little patriotic lore. You learned to sing "My Country 'Tis of Thee." You might learn one of the poems by that new poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, now that we're in Longfellow 100. And because for most of these kids it was not a pleasant experience, most of them did not persist to the 8th grade. And if you did persist to the 8th grade, you had definitely completed your schooling. But of course, the schools were interested not just in what the children were doing, but they were also interested in the immigrant parents. And here's the example of the Cleveland Public Schools, who in 6 different languages, which you might be able to read, some of them anyway, found opportunities to work with the adults, to provide the same familiarity with American culture for the adults, immigrant adults, that was provided for the children. And how did this all end up? This is one of the best schools in America in 1917, Bennett Street School in Boston. Now, I ask you, would you like your child to be in that school? All of you fancy aficionados of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, is that the kind of school you would like for your child? And if you had that many children in your classroom, wouldn't you want some means of trying to sort who they were, get some estimate about who was really worth betting on? Probably. And where would you look for that kind of expertise? Well, as World War I came around, you would look to those new people called psychologists, the term was. And these psychologists, one man who was in the middle of a midlife crisis at Harvard before he went to Yale, Robert Yerkes, and a few of his friends, got together and constructed the Army Alpha, which was a way to separate the people who had officer potential from the poor doughboys in World War I. And they got the help with one of those, we're going to see a lot of these Hoosier educators. This one, Lewis Terman, who went out to Stanford, who participated in developing group intelligence tests in which they thought that they were measuring, and they assured us that they were, and their helper, Carl Brigham, assured us of this too, that they were measuring native intelligence free of any cultural influences. And so these were the kinds of tests that would be given to these children. Now, we We sophisticated people of Cambridge, would we want that? Certainly not. So we want something else. New period comes on, the period of adjustment, 1920 to 1954. And the kind of woman whom we know here in Cambridge, great friend of Agnes Hocking, the founder of the Shady Hill School, a lady named Lucy Sprague Mitchell, this is what she prescribes for her children. Now, I hope maybe whether you can see this or not, this is the program for the City and Country School, which Lucy Sprague Mitchell and Caroline Pratt established in 1920. And if you notice the program for the day, on Monday, discussion, rhythm, shops are free period. Reading, shop is also open in case you don't want to read. Numbers, play in the yard, lunch, rest period, drawing, stories, play in the yard, home. This is elementary school. This is the beginning of what anybody who was not obsessed as I am with A's would call progressive education. But, of course, the point is, who were the children who were going to this school? They were the children of people like Lucy Sprague Mitchell and her husband, the famous economist Wesley Clare Mitchell, and we know economist children are always brilliant, don't we, Dick? Graduates of Williams College and nice places like this. What these early educators missed was the difference in what these children were learning at home and therefore what they could learn in school. So they provided for their children this kind of wonderful experience. Now, wouldn't we like our kids to have an experience of this kind? I think so. We'd think it was great. However, reforms take a long time to happen. And 20 years later, in southern Indiana, you will notice Miss Bruce sitting up here in the upper right-hand corner, upper left-hand corner for you. This is Miss Bruce with her 43 first graders in all white, all low income. You see some of the boys on the front row don't have shoes. It's not because they think it's modish, it's because they can't afford them in warm weather. And these are the 43 children. Now, what are Miss Bruce's qualifications for this enterprise? Is she like the people who work with Lucy Sprague Mitchell in City and Country School, who are mostly Ivy League Seven Sisters graduates? Miss Bruce has probably had a year of normal school. You think she's an experienced teacher? After this 1 year, Miss Bruce got out of teaching for good. I attribute her decision, and this is apocryphal. I don't know why she quit, except I think after 43 first graders you might quit. But you notice the little boy on the far right, the dark-haired boy with the white shirt with the dark collar. If I knew how, Bob would tell me there's a pointer here, but I don't know how. Anyway, he's right up there. He's also right back there behind Dan Torrance, my husband. This is his first grade class. The point that I want to make here is that the young children of this community who were not affluent, what kind of teacher do they have? The least qualified. Whereas those children of city country, the daughter of the professors of philosophy, the professors of economics, the literati of Greenwich Village, they have the best teacher. That pattern persists today. In this picture, two of those children went on to college. Lauren, my husband, who actually has made a perfectly decent life as a professor at Columbia and MIT and Harvard. His father was a science teacher in the school. The boy next to him's father was the principal. Those are the two who went to college, suggesting again that family influences do have an effect. Now, at the same time, if you were living in the Upper West Side of New York and you came from a cultural milieu comparable to that of Greenwich Village, this is the Lincoln School at Teachers College, a wonderful school, absolutely wonderful school. closed a little later in a fluff with Teachers College over its endowment. But here, these children who of cultural backgrounds comparable to those in Greenwich Village are constructing a map of South America, of Patagonia, rather than simply reading about it in a book. So I think that the legacy that we have from the period of adjustment is a legacy in which we failed to take account of the significance of the contribution of community, family, and culture for children. And we assumed that what was good for the children at the Lincoln School or the children at City and Country would be equivalently good elsewhere. Public schools like Winnetka, for example, or Wilmette did this, and they were excellent. Then, we got research into the game. Remember the 8-year study, the 30-school study, in which tracked children in graduating from so-called progressive schools like Lincoln and so on, versus ones graduating from traditional places and how well they did in selective colleges. The study was done in the 1930s. And the progressives found, to their great relief, that the graduates of the progressive schools did just as well as the graduates of the traditional schools. And what was the erroneous conclusion they drew from this? That curriculum didn't make a difference. And in concluding that curriculum did not make a difference, that is, that the graduates of these kinds of schools where you construct things as opposed to learn them in a rote way, that when they said the curriculum doesn't make a difference, what that meant was that then other educators, like Miss Pruce and her first graders, were free to say, well, it doesn't matter if children do not get academic skills. But of course, these children had plenty of academic skills, some acquired at the Lincoln School and some acquired elsewhere. Now, just to show the progressive education and the wonders of the Lincoln School in City and Country were not universal, these illustrations are two black schools in 1939 and 1941, one in Louisiana, in which this black mother has understood that it is extremely important that she support her children's schooling at home. And so she has rigged up with her smoky kerosene lamp a blackboard on which she has written so that to help her children in reading, "The rain are fallen," F-A-L-L-I-N. She has the right instincts. She has not had the opportunity to develop the sets of academic skills that she would have wished. The adjacent one is in Greene County, Georgia, 1941. This is the height of the Lincoln School, City and Country, Wilmette, Bronxville, all these progressive schools. This is what is available in segregated rural Georgia, a pot-bellied stove with a bunch of kids sitting around the edges without much facility. Now, what's happening to the testing movement? The testing movement is going great guns. The testing movement now has all kinds of tests that we're beginning to wonder if maybe testing is culture-free, if they really do measure innate intelligence only. We're beginning to get a little anxious about that. But testing is still very widespread, and the conviction that testing can tell us what a child can learn, that the IQ is fixed, that this is a measure of innate intelligence, native intelligence. This is gaining great credibility in this period from 1920 to 1954. And this is the only period in which the educators are the ones who are fundamentally calling the shots. Now, why are the educators alone calling the shots here? Well, the country's worried in the Depression about other issues, and then in the 40s it's worried about World War II. So the educators have a free run. Now, where do the educators? Who are these educators? And what is their experience of schooling? Throughout the 30s and well into the 40s, almost all the leading educators were white men, mostly Protestant, no Jews, very few Catholics. And what had been their experience in school? Their experience in school had been one of success. And they assumed that it was their innate ability that had led them to that success, because they had not, on the whole, recognized the obstacles that people who did not come from the cultural circumstances and genetic circumstances as they had. And they brought us the life adjustment curriculum in 1944, based on the 7 cardinal principles of education which had been enunciated in 1918. Now, when I was learning how, Lauren and I got engaged the first day of the second term of my sophomore year in college, and I then decided I better get a teacher's certificate because I had a feeling he might need to be supported because he might want to go to graduate school. Turned out to be an accurate assumption. So I, as part of my professional education course, I had to memorize the 7 cardinal principles of education. They had then been around for about 40 years. I wrote them down because I have tried to block them from my memory. But this is an example of the virtue curriculum triumphing over the knowledge curriculum. The 7 cardinal principles included worthy use of leisure time, ethical character, health, vocation, civic education, worthy home membership. That's 6 of the 7, okay, of what we're supposed to do in the high schools. And the last one is command of fundamental processes, and that was added, the NEA reports, in a little-known document, when they realized they were dealing with the South, and maybe in the South not everybody had command of fundamental processes in high school. But if those were the 7 cardinal principles of education, you can then see why in 1944 we could get Charles Prosser, who had brought us Smith-Hughes Vocational Act in 1917, why we would get him to bring us life adjustment education, in which the NEA and the U.S. Office of Education agreed that 20% of U.S. high school students were college material. That was high, 20%. 20% were vocational material, vocational training, and 60% needed a life adjustment education, freed of any academic requirements. Now, that is the curriculum that Arthur Powell and his colleagues wrote about in the Shopping Mall High School as what was still dominating American high schools up into the 80s. A curriculum in which it had been proved by educational research that the curriculum didn't matter, and that one subject was as good as another, and that this brought us the opportunity to get away from an academic curriculum, which we did in droves. 1954, something happened. White educators didn't notice it. Black educators did. And the American public noticed it. And, of course, what happened in 1954 was the Brown v. Board of Education decision making segregation in public schools unconstitutional. But for educators in the 1950s, the issue that was of most concern to them in this period, which I term the access period, was getting access to a classroom for their child. This was a period of tremendous overcrowding in the schools, tremendous effort to get youngsters into the school, and the caption as the mother brings her woe-begotten little son to class, she says to the teacher, who looks utterly distracted, she says, "Be sure to give mine special attention." The period of the 50s came with enormous criticism of educators, particularly of schools of education, but of less criticism of the schools, but still some criticism of the schools. So that the solution was to provide access to special programs. And the first of the access programs were the programs for the gifted and the talented. The programs for the gifted and the talented look very much like the very best of the programs of the 20s and the 30s and the 40s at Lincoln School, at City and Country, at Winnetka, in which academic subjects were presented in an interesting manner there for able children to manage them. However, by 1959, desegregation was beginning to move in the South. It was moving slowly. This is my high school. I lost my job here. It's the second time I lost my teaching job. The first time I lost it because I was pregnant. Deep Creek High School, which Dick referred to in the Dismal Swamp. I lost that job because I was pregnant and was thought to be a bad influence on the students. But 3 of the girls in my 9th grade homeroom had gotten pregnant before I had. So it didn't seem like that was, and certainly I wasn't responsible for this. But in 1959, I was teaching at Maury High School in Norfolk, and we all lost our jobs because the white city school system refused to accept 6 black children into the Norfolk Public Schools, the beginning of desegregation. This is the main auditorium, and you see the 1 black student at Maury when the school reopened in 1959, utterly isolated. It's interesting that there were many, many, many Americans who, in the 50s, opposed desegregation. They opposed it both in principle and in practice. The most recent data shows now that nearly 90% of Americans approve desegregation in principle. Whether they approve it in practice is another matter. Now you see a familiar face. There's the big change that happens in the 1960s. And the big change brings Frank Keppel on the right with James B. Conant, the former president of Harvard. We send Mr. Keppel to Washington. Why do we send Mr. Keppel to Washington? Well, we sent Mr. Keppel to Washington because John Kennedy, certainly when he was elected president, certainly did not want to appoint an educator as the commissioner of the U.S. Office of Education, since educators were in such ill repute as a result of attacks from academics. So he got a famous philosopher, or sort of famous philosopher, Sterling McMurrin from Utah, and had him be commissioner, but he took about 1 year in the job and decided he didn't like it. President Kennedy then turned to his Harvard classmate, and his Harvard classmate was Frank Keppel. Now, for those of us here at the Ed School, we all know Frank Keppel, of course. We knew him as an older man when he hung out in 420 Gutman, smoking those ghastly black cigars, and speaking so wisely but so softly to those of us who were trying to learn something about the education business. But Frank, in 1963, or 62, when he went to Washington, had been dean of the Ed School, a task for which he prepared. You know, Frank's only graduate study was a term of studying sculpture in Rome prior to World War II. That may have been the best preparation to be the dean of a graduate school of education or to be a commissioner of the U.S. Office of Education. But what Frank did was to do what people had been trying to do in Washington for 20 years, which was to get a federal aid to education bill passed. And he was able to do that. But the federal aid to education bill created the opportunity for the federal government to have some influence over school districts by virtue of the fact that they were sending them money. But then this was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, of which Title I, which was the biggest piece of it, sent federal money to schools to give what Frank called compensatory education. And in calling it compensatory education, Keppel and his colleagues understood that a child who had grown up in Miss Bruce's classroom in Raymond, Indiana, probably did not have the same set of cultural experiences as the children of Wesley Clare and Lucy Sprague Mitchell in New York. And that these children who grew up in concentrations of poverty probably needed something extra in school. On the whole, it was assumed that school districts, given a choice, would not spend that money on those children. And therefore, there needed to be some way to tie that money to spending it on those children. And this was the task of Keppel's successor, Doc Howe, with President Johnson, who linked the Civil Rights Act to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, saying that unless you desegregate, you will not get the money because you will be in violation of the Civil Rights Act. Now, what happened with these two people is that they were the most unlikely public school advocates for low-income children and for children of color. Keppel had gone to Groton and then to Harvard. Howe had gone to Taft and then to Yale. Howe, as you know, was called Doc. Doc didn't have a Doc had begun a master's degree in history at Columbia, but when Sibby got pregnant again, she said, "Doc, got to get a job." And so Doc had dropped out of his graduate program. Of course, Keppel had never had one. And yet these two men of privilege were the men who were able to shape American policy, and I'm using that word advisedly, for the benefit of low-income children. Now, I look out here and I see many policy experts, some of them smiling and others rolling their eyes. But before 1960s, we didn't have education policy. We had foundations of education, which were psychological or social foundations. We had pedagogy, but we certainly didn't have policy. And what the creation of policy did to schools of education was to turn them on their ear. And the policy people were creating plans for educational activities. But many of the policy people who were deep into the creation of these kinds of plans for school had themselves no experience with low-income children, with children of color, or with children who had difficulty in school. Because by the nature of it, a policy person at a major university had probably done pretty well in school. And that policy person, almost always he in those days, had sent his children to very good schools. So their experience, direct experience of the practice of schooling as it affected low-income children and children of color was minuscule. And therefore, the policy danger was such that the same kind of problem of generalizing progressive education for the children of the affluent to everybody was likely to take place in the policy realm. And this, meanwhile, the schools kept moving along as the shopping mall high school reports, and the policy people worked on these very fractious issues: desegregation, bilingual education, the problems of the education of all handicapped, or as we now say, we don't say handicapped anymore, but 94-142 called them handicapped. All were making an effort to provide access for these youngsters into special programs, because there was a general but unstated assumption that the regular program wasn't very good. And the regular program wasn't very good. And that brought us in 1983 to A Nation at Risk, which was one of about 8 reports that came out in the spring of 1983, each of which said that the schools needed to improve. And there's people thought that this was actually part of the Reagan administration's, President Reagan's educational initiative, but in fact, as Jerry Holton said here at Asquith a couple of years ago, it was not Reagan's plan at all. But what The Nation at Risk, because it was so written and because it was so well written and because it was short, galvanized public attention around the need to shift the main activities of schooling into a much greater focus on achievement. Now, this is an unlikely figure to argue as an exemplar of this era. But I would argue that Al Shanker, probably as much as anybody, in the 80s until his death in the 90s, was a person who could speak to the different constituencies who were interested in improving the academic achievement of American youth. This is the same Al Shanker whom Woody Allen called the man who destroyed the world in Sleeper, the movie Sleeper. But Shanker changed. And when Shanker Shanker's, taught here for 5 years, one day a week, hanging out up there on the 4th floor with Frank Kempel and Doc Howe. And that was the Shanker who could address the realities and the problems of American schooling in an important way. So we get to many of you are much more expert in the current period than I, and so I'm going to move over this quickly. But we get to the current enthusiasm in which we see schooling now as to what is it for? Well, schooling is to help you get a good job, and the way that we know you can get a good job is if you score well on tests. That seems pretty simplistic in terms of the broader notions of wit and character, or knowledge and virtue, and what a society needs and what a youngster needs. But even teachers are supposed to score well on the tests. And you'll be pleased to know that we have listed the correct answer at the bottom. So today I would argue that in our schools, what we are seeking what is good for the child and what is good for the economy. But we have lost a broader discussion of what the larger role of education and what the role of schooling in a society is. And we no longer think schooling is complete when you finish high school. Rather, you've got to think about college now. And so I want to speak very briefly about college. 1900, this is a picture of my alma mater. This is Purdue in 1900. And I hope that what you see is a place that is barren. Purdue was typical of good American colleges and universities then and now. It was typical. And what was it? It was barren, it was isolated, it was intellectually weak, it was impoverished, it was racist, sexist, and anti-Semitic. Other than that, it was fine. I gave this talk in West Lafayette in February, and I'm back to tell the tale. Although it was a little chancy while I gave it, I have to say. But I want to repeat what I said then, which is true, that I say all these things about Purdue because Purdue was typical. That is what American collegiate education was like for the 2% of kids who went to college in the early 20th century. It was transformed by World War II. But listen, if you were black, and if you were a girl, and you lived in the South, and you wanted a higher education in the early years of the 20th century, and you went to one of the finest black institutions, Tuskegee, this was your higher education, mattress making. World War II changed this. Why did World War II change higher education so dramatically? It was transformed, first of all, by the need for research that the Americans felt they needed to win the war, particularly the Manhattan Project. And the only place, if there had been another place besides universities to be able to do that research, it would have been nice, but there weren't any, so they had to do it in the universities. Chicago gave up its stadium in order to do that. But the second element that transformed American higher education in the middle years of the 20th century were Jews. Because some of the people who were most important in being able to solve the problems of the Manhattan Project were Jewish scientists, many of whom were emigres, but not all of whom were emigres. And when I tell the sad story of Purdue, I tell the story of my father, who taught at Purdue, and of his colleague Karl Lachorowitz, who taught at Purdue. Mr. Lachorowitz came to Purdue as Karl Horowitz from Vienna in 1928. He could not buy a house in West Lafayette because he was Jewish. He married a woman named Betty Lark, and after that he was known as Karl Lachorowitz. The dean of the School of Engineering at Purdue, a very distinguished engineer, A. Potter, regularly attended services with his wife at Central Presbyterian Church in Lafayette. It came as an enormous shock to everybody's system when he died in his 90s, in the 70s, and the rabbi said Kaddish for him. Nobody had known that this was the case. So I think that for those of us today who think that this is not a problem, that we need to remember how much we owe to some of those emigre physicists and some of the brilliant native-born scientists and Jews who helped to integrate American universities. The other group who helped were the GIs. There wasn't a major university president in America who supported the GI Bill. Robert Maynard Hutchins, the president of the University of Chicago, said that admitting the GIs would create educational hobo jungles on the campuses, and James B. Conant was also absolutely opposed because he thought that the universities, that there were only a very small number of people who were really smart enough to be able to benefit from university education. And what Conant at least had the grace to say that he was wrong and said that the GIs had been our best students. Now, Julie Rubin is writing a terrific book on this period of American higher education since World War II, which I look forward to reading in full detail. I'm sure she looks forward to finishing it. But I want to, probably a point in which she and I have a different emphasis, is that I would argue that one of the great contributions that the American college and university made in the post-war period was that they were centers of social concern. And if the youth are not interested in moral problems and social problems, it is hard to imagine that the older folks, my generation, will be. And many of these expressions of social concern that we saw in the 60s and the 70s, whether they began with the free speech movement in Berkeley in 1964, or the protests in New York at Columbia against the gymnasium near Harlem, or against civil rights violations, or against the discrimination against women, or against secrecy in research. Many of those protests were conducted in manners that were not seemly, as my mother would say. But on the other hand, some of them were very important for the society. And when you think about whether you want to have students having panty raids on campuses, or whether you want to have them discussing those kinds of social concerns, I guess I'll take the social concerns any day of the week. We've had a few. I remember one in this room when Derek Bach came to discuss why he did not believe that the university should divest its holdings in South Africa, and many of our students and faculty did not agree with that and marched outside. I remember holding the baby of one of the students who was leading the protest. I thought that was kind of a way to stay in touch. But I think that when our campuses lose the capacity to raise these questions, and when we, the grown-ups, don't raise them ourselves, something is lost. So, to conclude, what I've been arguing here is that these institutions have an obligation to bring up the next generation with both knowledge and virtue, with enhanced wit and character. But we have had enormous difficulty doing it in a timely fashion, and we've had a great difficulty in finding the balance between wit and character, knowledge and virtue that we want to emphasize with our students. We have difficulty addressing the question, what is the education for? Is it for the country, so that the country will have responsible grown-ups who can contribute to the country? Or is it for the individual child to be able to get ahead? Obviously, it's for both. But what is the balance that we seek? Nobody, in an era of sound bites, nobody wants to talk about balance. But somehow it is that balance that we need to achieve. And in the end, I'm very optimistic. Because in the end, when I think about that school where my father began, where he was slapped because he didn't speak English, or I think about that picture of the Purdue campus and the terrible things that went on at Purdue in the early and middle years of the 20th century, you know, things are a lot better at Purdue now. things are a lot better in Otter Tail County, Minnesota. Things are a lot better at Maury High School. Norfolk this year won the Eli Broad Award for the best urban school system. Who would have believed it? So I'm optimistic. Not that we don't have a great many problems yet to be solved, but at least we're thinking about them. 40, 50 years ago, we in these schools of education, we weren't thinking about some of these problems so much. Now we're thinking about them. Thinking might lead to action. Action might lead to improvement. So, on the whole, I'm optimistic, and thank you for the opportunity to be here this evening.
Thank you very much, Pat. Pat has agreed to take questions. Our ground rules are that at asking a question, don't take any more than 1 minute to ask the question, please. And so if you care to ask a question, will you come to one of the two mics, please? Would you say who you are, please?
Yes, of course. Patrick O'Connor. I'm professor of education at Worcester State College. I had a chance to read your book quickly, enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
And I enjoyed your presentation. So the question I'm going to ask is a little bit focused on the book. Maybe not everyone can relate to it. I was intrigued toward the end, Dr. Graham, when you used the metaphor of the school as a kind of donut, in the sense that what we know, we know a lot about what's on the periphery, what's on the edge. We can quantify demographic factors about students and staff, et cetera, et cetera. But the big lacuna in the middle, the hole in the donut, for you represents what I take it, what we need to make a flourishing school, or how we can understand learning and teaching and learning. That's in the whole part. Now, I know this is a big question, and I don't know if you, looked into maybe give us some suggestions as to what might be there to lead to good teaching and best practices in terms of cognitive research, if there's anything that comes to mind. You did talk about need for financial support, educational research, a focus on that, and improved teacher training, and those are wonderful things, but I'm just wondering if that's a next issue for you, the issue of the brain and learning and all of that. Any simple suggestions on that?
Well, you're a close reader, Mr. O'Connor. I did talk about a donut. Liz City and Wendy Angus and I have discussed the donut metaphor and whether that was adequate or appropriate or not. And you have it exactly right, that I think that we know quite a lot about the ring of the donut. But I say in the book that we have a void when it comes to the hole, which is where the children are actually expected to develop the knowledge and the virtue that we wish for them. And I've been chastised by Jim Greeno, for example, who says, oh, we know a lot about that. And he has a point. And I say in the book, I mention a number of people, Dick Murnane, Dick Elmore, Tony Brike, David Cohen, Jeannie Oakes, a batch of folks who are working on these kinds of questions, many of the people in this room. One of the things that encourages me is that we are working on those kinds of questions now. And certainly when I was a graduate student at Columbia in the late 50s and the early 60s, there wasn't anybody working on those kinds of questions. So that's a ground for optimism. When I think about when I think about Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's work on respect, which has to be an important ingredient of these experiences of children and the grown-ups whom they encounter in schools. That's very important. But what we don't have is the kind of understanding of the issues of educational practice that we need. We're getting it, but we haven't got it yet. We're probably not going to get it in some simple magic bullet. But I'm extraordinarily impressed when I think about the people with whom I went to graduate school in the 50s and the 60s and what they worked on, what I worked on. I mean, I'm a historian, what do I know? But I mean, the people who worked on real current things, what they worked on then and what people are working on now. People are beginning to get at these kinds of questions. You look over here at Mr. Mind, Brain, and Cognition. When I first talked to him, he was telling me about teaching of math and the teaching of arithmetic. Is that fair, Kurt? This seems to me like, as we say, he's come a long way, baby. It's not that the other work wasn't good. It was very good. But this represents steps forward to deal with this messy, messy problem of educational practice. And people are always telling me to think about the medical schools. The medical schools have it all figured out. Well, the essence of, and they say the hospitals, they've got it figured out. And I'm now looking for my friend Pat Reed Potty, who with whom I have had some of this discussion, where she does have it figured out. But the focus in medicine is on diagnosis and then treatment. You know, when Miss Bruce has 43 first graders, let me tell you, she is not into diagnosis. She is into control. Yet we know today much more about this than we did 40 years ago, and I am confident that we'll know even more later on.
Thank
you. George Zimmerman, professor of physics, was wondering, there are two items which you didn't talk about, and that is, in the ancient days, pre-60s, there were essentially some noblesse oblige attempts at education from the very rich people. Did they have any influence? Secondly, in the 60s, there was this questioning of authority, curriculum, and just the students know best. How did that influence, and what are the remnants of it in today's education?
Well, let me take the first question if I understand it correctly. The noblesse oblige of the 50s you're talking about?
50s and before.
And
for instance, I remember Tolstoy had children come to his house and try to learn, or he tried to teach them.
Well, I guess it would be very important, you know, so who were the children who were coming, and were they in the mood to learn?
They were village children.
Yeah, but I guess I would say that one of the most important things in understanding whether a child learns, in addition to the experiences that the youngster has had in the family and the community, is the talent and temperament. And for most formal schooling is much more dependent on a youngster's temperament. That's a much more important variable than the child's talent is. And if the children wanted to come to Yasna Polyana and sit around there because this was a famous fellow in the neighborhood, and he was a good storyteller, and there is evidence he was a good storyteller, then I think that, of course, that would, I mean, that's the same thing as the old Williams business about Mark Hopkins and the log. But I think that the difficulty we have in analogizing from those kinds of experiences is that if you've got is we had, 53 million school children. Not all of them are in the mood to learn. And not all teachers and administrators are gifted at getting them in the mood. So figuring out how you get them in the mood to learn and what it is you want them to learn sounds like it's still an important problem. But, if I'd been a youngster, well, I'll give you a different example. My grandmother, for whom I am named, never spoke a word of English. Lived in this country 50, 60 years maybe. Never spoke a word of English. Didn't think it was worth it to learn it. Probably right. Not for her, it wasn't. And yet her earliest memories are sitting in her native town, Odense, and listening to this man tell fairy tales. His name was Hans Christian Andersen. So she instilled in us, her grandchildren, or at least some of us, anyway, a real interest in these kinds of things, even though her own formal education was extremely limited. I know who this one is.
Oh, John Willett, your colleague.
My friend.
Pat, I was born in 1947 in another country. And my elementary school had 54, 55 people in it, controlled by corporal punishment. Looked a lot like some of the schools you were showing there. And I'm not a historian, but one thing I remember that occurred around 1957 was a great disruption in curriculum, particularly in the secondary schools in England, as a consequence of the launching of Sputnik.
Yep, October.
I think there were dramatic changes that came very quickly in the wit end of the curriculum. And I am really conscious, subsequent to that, when I became a high school teacher myself, of the dramatic changes that had occurred in the teaching of science and mathematics and even geography and Latin since I'd studied those things myself in school. And I noticed you didn't talk about that.
It's in the book.
Oh. Judy, isn't that what we say when we give talks? It's in the book.
And you're right, John. I didn't. But it's in the discussion of the gifted and the talented, because you see, in the United States, when this happened, this was at the moment in which we were providing access for the gifted and talented, special programs that did this new math, science. This is Jerry Holton's science. It was Gerald Zacharias' science program. It was BSSE, all this NSF-funded work. But this was the same moment that most American kids were going through a curriculum that did not include this kind of work. This was what was available for the gifted and talented. This was available in schools serving affluent families. Affluent families seem to have an overrepresentation in their mind of the gifted and talented. I've never understood that entirely. So that this was, in fact, a very important effort, led almost entirely by people outside schools of education. This is what Jerry Bruner wrote, his terrific book based on the Woods Hole conferences, in which he said the best minds, or what the best minds wanted, and that should be able to be done by ordinary school teachers. These people didn't know anything about ordinary school teachers. The three educators who were at that meeting were our colleague, Jack Carroll, the reading man who was here, Henry Chauncey, who was a friend of the ETS, who was a friend of Bruner's, and John Fisher, who was the new president of Teachers College. Everybody else was a professor of math and science. And so they were interested in getting their discipline across to future math and science people. And it had a terrific effect. The National Defense Education Act had a terrific effect on a small upper stratum of youth, some of whom were not affluent, but the majority of whom were.
Hi. My name is Euphemia Briere, and I work for Boston Public Schools. I'm in special education. Since we are in the era of achievement, as you pointed out, and the focus seems to be on how well students do on testing, I wanted to bring up the subject wanting to know the prevailing opinion concerning the increased mandatory testing, especially in Massachusetts, the MCAS, which has been a subject for great debate. And so that's the first part of my question. With regard to what you were saying about bringing back that balance, and what happened to character and wit and virtue, etc., which can't be measured by MCAS. So that's one question. And the second is, having worked in special education for a number of years, I'm interested in the prevailing opinion on the worth of the integration and inclusion that is practiced now, which spends a great deal of funds on children who are probably not going to be that functional in life, and they also cause these prevailing average of scores to be brought down in local school systems. Long ago, children with very special needs used to be educated separately. So this is a different kind of problem than integration of a racial or cultural, but it's integration of cognitive levels. So I just want to know your opinion on that. So first on MCAS and then on...
Well, I think Massachusetts is fortunate with its testing system, since every state except Iowa now has them. MCAS is better than a lot of the others, and that's a good thing. And I actually, I'm a believer in tests, but I'm also a believer in not thinking that tests give a general answer to a complex question of whether a child has been well educated. I think tests give a quite specific answer about what a youngster has learned about a certain often rather narrow subject. And I think we educators needed to be pushed to have tests, because I think that the families who most need those test scores are those families whose children were not being well treated in the school system. And without the knowledge that their children were not being well educated by a school system, without those test results, many parents didn't know that. Now, you and Frank, not this most recent book, but the book before, you talk about a community in Texas, Zavala or something like that. And if I'm remembering this correctly, and since the authority is now here to state, wasn't this the case that those parents, many of those Spanish-speaking parents, were unaware that their children were getting a lousy education, and until the test results came out, the children were getting B's, and they thought, you're getting a B, that's fine. But they didn't realize the child wasn't learning anything. I may be misstating this. But what the test scores did in that community was to mobilize the parents about the inadequacies of the school system. Now, to me, the great danger in the tests is to think that they tell us more than they do. Tests tell us something that's good to know, but they do not tell us whether somebody has wit, or they certainly doesn't tell us whether they have character, and they do not tell us any of the most important things about that person's academic ability, which has to do with their ingenuity, their creativity, their ability to utilize data and to move forward on their own. Those things they don't tell. Those things are important to know. On the other hand, without the tests, some atrocities occurred in our school system, particularly in schools that should have been the link for youngsters to be able to learn, in which these schools simply were not doing what needed to be done. Now, in terms of the special ed business, you know much more about special ed than I do. So I would be important. Yike. And now another special ed creature just came in. Tom Hare. So between the two of you, you can take me to the cleaners on special ed. But nonetheless, on my way to the cleaners, let me say that two things. One, that what happened to youngsters with disabilities in the past was a great loss, both for the children and for the country. And we have now learned that children whom we thought could not make a contribution to society because of their disabilities can make a contribution to society, sometimes an extremely valuable one. I think of our blind friend, Lawrence and my blind friend, who is on the D.C. Court of Appeals, making a monumental contribution to the country. So I think the old system was bad, and we lost a lot of talent. Talent is widely dispersed in highly different ways in our society, and the trick is to take advantage of that talent and to nurture that talent where we can find it. Now, are we nurturing it? Do we give it too rich a diet? Do we give it heavy cream when really skim milk would be more appropriate? You're saying that for some of these people we spend too much. Yeah, maybe. This is a rich society. When I see some of the ways in which money is spent in this society on things that don't seem to me as important as trying to help a person live a better life, I can't get too worried about spending it on kids who may not be able to have as full a life as we would hope. I suspect, the hard question would be, if you asked me this question in a society that was impoverished, in which resources were very limited, and you had to pick which resources, which groups you were going to spend the resources on, that would be a harder question for me. And then I might say, well, we may simply have to cut back on some of these very, very expensive activities in which we engage for some of these special ed children. But in this society, when I see the money sloshing around here, I can't feel quite as concerned about that. But I think you and Tom should figure this out. This is blue shirt and a blue tie. Tie, yike.
Hi, Pat. Susan Moore Johnson. I was thinking about Sputnik before John spoke, and I was born before John. But I also remember it as this dramatic trigger. And I'm wondering whether there's anything comparable that triggers the character virtue side of educational change.
Well, that's a really good question, Susan, and I wish I knew the answer. I guess my instinct would be that some of the corporate scandals that we have seen lately, I just came back from Houston. Houston is all abuzz with will Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling go to prison. I think some of the corporate scandals may have some kind of triggering effect. There's no doubt about the fact that World War II had an enormous impact on the virtues associated with teamwork, hard work, loyalty to the country, and so on. And I consider teamwork, hard work, integrity, respect, civic virtue. I consider those the kinds of virtues that schools are interested in instilling. But I think that the schools are fighting a huge problem, particularly for adolescents, with the culture, because the school is a much less potent force than the adolescent culture is, and the adolescent culture, at least as we see it manifest commercially right now, is not always as strong on virtue as we might think. But yet when we say that, and then we see what's happening to American kids when they grow up in the world and become very hardworking, industrious, ingenious, and willing to work with a group, then you think maybe they're doing okay. So I think it's very easy to call for these things. I think it's much harder to make them happen. I think that's true for both the knowledge and the virtue side, both the wit and the character side. And the point I've made over and over again ad nauseum is these things take a long time. But that's why I like the example of Deep Creek and Norfolk Maury High School, and the fact that Maury High School in Norfolk could win this year's Broad Award primarily because of their alleged gains in black achievement. Nobody would have dreamed of that in 1957 and 58 when I was teaching there. And nor did anybody there ever notice that there was anything that Sputnik needed to do for Maury at the time. It was only 10 years later that people talked about those kinds of things. My eye says it's 7 o'clock.
Yes. Thank you very much, Pat.